Hello everybody, my name is Jude Lennon. I am an author and storyteller based in Liverpool in the northwest of England. I'm also the very proud winner of the first place in the Book Dragon Literary Awards for the adult fiction category. And that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to read you the prologue and chapter 1 from that winning novel, which is called Kintsugi. Here we go. The prologue. And this is set on the 15th of May, 1968. As soon as I saw my mother, I knew there was something wrong. Her normally smiling face looked positively drawn. When she walked into the room, I could feel the nervous tension she brought with her. Immaculately dressed as usual, her beautiful clothes were a thin disguise. Her posture, normally so upright, was aged and weary, and she made her way hesitantly across the room towards me. With shaking hands, she reached out and clasped mine before guiding me to the settee. Once we were seated, she seemed uncertain how to continue. The seconds passed, and with a ragged breath, she released my hands only to clasp and wring her own until I couldn't bear it any longer and lay mine, hers to still them. What's the matter, Mum? Is it Dad or Grandma? A knot of fear formed in my stomach. Your father's coming now. We need to tell you together. Now, thoroughly alarmed, I raised my eyes to the doorway as my father appeared. The smile he usually reserved for his daughters was missing, and he took up position by the fireplace. He looked so remote, I almost didn't recognize him. What on earth could be the matter? Please, just tell me, I begged. You're really scaring me. My mother cleared her throat, and I waited for the blow. Your father and I, actually, not your father and I. I'm sorry, darling. I'm making an awful mess of this. It's so terribly difficult. As always in times of stress, she placed her whole dependence on my father, who once more stepped in to save her. His usual calm voice trembled, but the words were finally free and clear. We love you so very much. We always have, and we always will. But the truth is, although we have loved you as ours, you aren't actually ours. Your mother and I aren't your parents. Time stood still, but the clock on the fireplace ticked on. Surely I'd misheard. My breath caught in my chest and the walls closed in around me. If I hadn't been sitting, I swear I would have fallen to the floor. I was stunned. My father's words had made sense when they left his mouth, but the air all around had tangled them into something utterly incomprehensible. What do you mean? I whispered. We aren't your real parents, darling. My mother's tears fell freely. They splashed onto her dress, leaving stains and blemishes. Please believe us, Eve. This changes nothing, sweetheart. We still love you wholeheartedly. Her hands were clutching mine so tightly my fingers were crushed. I pulled them free and stood up. My legs felt strangely detached from my body, but they made the shaking steps across the room to the window. I gazed out onto the idyllic garden where I'd celebrated my 21st birthday just 2 months previously. My gaze wandered to the apple tree at the far end, which was still home to the swing drifting in the breeze. A garden full of childhood memories with my sister Susan, or not my sister as it now transpired. In one sentence, I had been bereft of mum, dad, and sister. I was an orphan, cast out on the world. I leaned my head against the glass, and although it cooled my forehead, there was no comfort. Helen and Frances Fenwick were not my parents. Mum and dad were not my mum and dad. My sister was not my sister. The phrases repeated themselves around and around. Eventually, my brain accepted the words and tried to process what they meant. I turned to face them. Frances had joined Helen on the settee and she was weeping freely into his shoulder. They looked broken. So, if you aren't my parents. Chapter 1, 2019. It had started like any typical Friday. I'd been to my regular leisurely ladies Zumba class and was showered and ready for the day ahead. First things first, of course, tea. I hummed as the kettle boiled on the old Arga. Its cosy warmth filled the kitchen like a comforting hug. The Arga had been a strictly practical thing when we'd moved in all those years ago. There had been nothing glamorous about its ability to heat the house and provide hot water, but something had told us to keep hold of it even when we renovated. Now, of course, they are the height of new kitchen chic. Our neighbours had offered us a generous amount of money if we wanted to sell ours. We hadn't, and I couldn't imagine a time when we ever would. It was part of the house, just as Clive and I were. It was a beautiful morning and the sun shone brightly enough to lift the spirits of anyone. I glanced out of the window onto our good-sized garden with trees, shrubs and flowers of all colours. Over in the corner, just touching the branches of the cherry tree, was a summer house. I know this sounds ridiculous as it's only a building, but just looking at it always made me smile. I'd wanted one for years, and Clive had surprised me for my 30th birthday. The planning and subterfuge required to get it done in secret had been worthy of MI5. My parents had ably assisted with childcare, and my sister Susan and her husband Duncan had suggested a birthday weekend away, which Clive and I had snapped at. When we returned home, Clive had told me no peeping before guiding my steps through the house and out into the garden. My eyes had widened in wonder when they were finally allowed to take in the most perfect gift. It was beautifully made and beautifully given. Octagonal and constructed from cedarwood, it was my little sanctuary. I decorated it with care and had optimistically filled it with a chaise longue and bookcase before the weather of the Scottish borders reminded me that I'd need to be a little bit more practical. More appropriate wicker furniture with removable cushions and a sturdy table had been shipped in as replacements, and they'd stayed there ever since. Clive had even had it hooked up to the electric supply so we could have a little heat for the not-so-balmy evenings. We often sat there with a gin or whiskey chatting over the day. Sometimes we simply sat in contented silence. The stars seemed to know how to twinkle at their very best when we gazed at them through the doorway, which became a perfect frame. The sun would be warming it in an hour or so, and I'd take my crossword out to my customary seat. It was my dry day habit. People call them man caves or she sheds now, but to us it will only ever be the summer house. The kettle sang and I dropped a tea bag into my favourite mug and added the water. All in all, I was very content with life. I was 72 years old and in good health, own hair and mostly my own teeth still intact. My mind was still sharp and I could exercise regularly, albeit at a gentler pace than in my youth. My once luxuriant brown hair may have faded to salt and pepper, but it was still thick. As for the wrinkles around my eyes, they reflected a good and happy life, a happy life full of laughter with Clive. We'd been married for 50 years and it felt like 5. We clicked the first time we met at the Harvest Festival dance. Our rhythm had matched, and that was that. Married within 6 months, baby number 1 just 10 months later, and baby number 2 3 years after that. Now it seems strange to think of ourselves not only as parents, but also as grandparents, and more recently, even great-grandparents. Our marriage had healed my family and brought us back together as a whole unit. Clive's support and good sense had helped me to accept that my parents, Helen and Francis, were still mum and dad, despite the biological facts. Our own children had cemented that healing further, and we reached a place of contentment. The letterbox clattered and Benji, our schnauzer, bounded down the stairs with an energetic bark. That's enough, Benji, it's only the post. I removed my tea bag, added milk and a spoonful of sugar, and went to retrieve the milk from the mat. Benji looked at me expectantly. There's nothing for you, lad. Go and find Clive. Benji disappeared upstairs again. I scooped up the post, which was a larger haul than normal, and deposited it on the kitchen table. Benji bounded back down the stairs and trotted into the room. He sniffed the air eagerly and tried to jump up to the table. Something obviously smelt good to him, and his tiny tail wagged furiously. Get down, Benji. You know you're not allowed to do that. Clive's head appeared around the corner of the door. Anything interesting in the post, love? I haven't looked yet, but I doubt it. Takeaway menus and flyers for stair lifts seems to be our lot these days. Well, you don't need my help to file those in the recycling. I'll take Benji for his walk. Shall I stop off and pick up a couple of cream cakes on the way back? Clive called Benji over and started to scruff his ears and head with gentle fingers. Lovely. Don't forget to take his towel with you. You know he'll only get muddle over the car. Clive came to my side and planted a kiss on my forehead before whistling. This was Benji's cue. The next few minutes were full of the usual manic excitement he exhibited before any walk. He repeatedly jump-turned as Clive retrieved his lead, ball and poo bags. Trying his best to trip Clive up, Benji started his other favourite game of hurtling from one end of the hall to the other. One of these days he'd do one of us a serious injury, but we couldn't stop him. There was no point even attempting to do anything until they'd gone. I sipped my tea and waited. See you later, love, Clive called, and he and Benji finally left the house. I allowed the peace and tranquillity to settle. As much as I loved Clive, I did relish these moments of pure silence and the knowledge that I had the house to myself for a good couple of hours. I hummed as I looked through the post. Among the usual junk, there was one weighty envelope with a handwritten name and address. It was thick enough to contain a book. I felt along the sides. Definitely not a book. And I hadn't ordered anything of late anyway. The envelope was of a quality I hadn't seen since my grandmother's writing box. My humming stopped and my attention was most definitely caught. A real letter? I mean, who even still receives real letters? And more importantly, who still sends them? I turned it over with excitement. Maybe it was a wedding invitation, although I couldn't imagine who from, and it held a mighty gift list if that were the case. I didn't recognise the writing, which was beautiful. Loopy and fluid, it caressed the paper, promising treasures untold inside. The postmark was the only blemish, smudged and messy. It was impossible to make out. I deposited the other less interesting items in the recycling box and returned to the sunroom with my tea. Apart from the summer house, this was my favourite room. It was the house Clive and I had shared since our second child, Marianne, had been born. The sunroom ran across the back of the dining room with patio doors onto the garden. We'd had it built a year or so after we first moved in, so I could keep an eye on the children as they played. Now every house down the street has a conservatory, or garden room, as many of them are now known, but I like to think that our little sunroom was the inspiration. We set the ball rolling, you could say. It may be shabby compared to the shiny, sleek UPVC or bifolding door offerings of the other dwellings, but we love it. The cushions on the seats have taken on our imprints. You can tell exactly who sits where just by looking at them. Even Benji's bed looks as if he's been there forever. I popped my mug down onto a handmade coaster, a present from my eldest grandchild many years ago, and settled into my chair. I looked at the letter in my hand and was once more struck by the weight of it. It was so intriguing. I slipped my finger under a loose corner and tugged. Inside were 14 individual letters tied up together with a piece of ribbon. Just by looking at them, I could tell the envelopes were of a similar quality to the one they'd all been posted in. They felt thick and smooth under my fingers. What delights could they hold? I was thoroughly intrigued now. I couldn't remember the last time I'd received one letter through the post, never mind a bundle of 14. In our 70s we may be, but Clive and our friends have embraced the ease of emails and smartphones. The ribbon was a beautiful shade of green, and that too suggested quality and money. I pulled it loose. The crisp, creamy envelopes fanned out across my knee. They were numbered 1 to 14, and the top one bore the message, "Read in order, this one first." The fountain pen had embedded extra emphasis into that short phrase. I needed no more encouragement and tore the envelope open to reveal several sheets of paper. As I unfolded them, a black and white photograph fluttered onto my lap. I glanced at it. A small child and a lady with a baby on her lap sat at a table laid with a miniature tea set. The lady looked vaguely familiar. I set the photograph on the table and returned to the letter. I was struck again by the beauty of the fluid, dancing letters which formed such tantalising words, but no address or date. What a letdown. I'd expected every one of the writing conventions to be obeyed by someone with such artistic flair. Swallowing my disappointment and another mouthful of tea, I started to read. And that's when Eve, the main character in here, suddenly has her world changed upside down by these letters that reveal an awful lot about her past. So, if you are intrigued and want to find out what has happened in Eve's past and how that will impact on her future, you can get yourself a copy of Kintsugi from the Book Dragon, either in person at the shop in Stockton-on-Tees or by visiting their website, bookdragonuk.co.uk. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed my novel. I've enjoyed sharing the excerpts with you.